All right, I think it's time to get this going. We just want to start off by welcoming everyone to the NEH virtual workshop that we have sent out to our friends on Capitol Hill, and we'd like to thank all of the congressional offices for their help in making this possible and in getting the word out for us to constituents all over the country. We're excited to do this. We hope that this is the first of many that we're going to be able to do. This is actually the first that we have done, and so we are looking forward to doing this. We hope to be able to give you multiple ways to ask questions and for us to answer them. So you can do this while we're talking, and you'll see many other ways of doing that as we go. But make sure that you, if you have a question, to reach out to us through one of those ways. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Sack to run the workshop. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks for the introduction, and it's good to be with you all today. Thanks also to the congressional offices who helped to publicize this event. We are here to tell you about how an NEH grant could support your community and your work. As Tim mentioned, I'm Dan Sack, a program officer at the NEH. I'm joined today by a group of NEH colleagues who will be helping answer your questions. Here's the agenda for the day. I'll talk for about a half an hour. I'll describe the NEH and define what we mean by the humanities. I'll tell you about some of the work that the NEH supports and how you can apply for an NEH grant. I'll offer some suggestions for writing a good grant application and how you can find out more. That should leave us about a half an hour to answer questions. Please use the Q&A box on the right side of your screen to enter in your questions. During the presentation, some of my colleagues will be answering specific questions and highlighting questions that we can be asked of more general interest that I'll discuss after the presentation is over. Please also note that this presentation is closed captioned. Please click on the CC box at the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Here's the key message, all you really need to know. 1, all this information is on our website at neh.gov. 2, NEH grant programs are competitive, but you won't get a grant unless you apply. 3, if you're thinking about applying for a grant, read the Notice of Funding Opportunity, also called the guidelines. They will help you write a better application. Those are all on our website too. 4, talk to an NEH program officer. That's why we're here. Write us or call us. We will reply and we will help. I'll start with some basics. The National Endowment for the Humanities supports public and scholarly engagement with the humanities by making grants to nonprofit organizations and individuals. Our grantees are schools and universities, museums and libraries, teachers and scholars. The NEH is a federal agency established in 1965, supported by taxpayer funds. All NEH employees are public servants, working to be good stewards of those funds. Each year, the NEH awards about 750 grants, ranging in size from $6,000 to $600,000. In the last fiscal year, we made about $132 million in grants, plus an additional $67 million in grants for emergency coronavirus relief. The endowment's work focuses on the humanities, which is the public and scholarly study of human society and culture. Here's how Congress defined the humanities in 1965. It includes history, literature, art history, philosophy, archaeology, religion, jurisprudence, and the humanistic social sciences. The NEH supports the humanities across the country in several ways. We strengthen teaching and learning in classrooms from kindergarten to college. We support vital research and writing in the humanities. We nurture public programs that engage Americans of every age. We fund libraries and museums that preserve and disseminate cultural resources. We strengthen humanities institutions, large and small. We encourage new technologies and methods for research in the humanities. And we support state and local engagement with the humanities. The best way to understand the NEH's work is to learn about the projects we support. Here are some big and nationally known projects, as well as some small projects with a local impact. All these projects will show you the breadth of our grantees and the variety of their work. I hope they might inspire you to apply to support your work in the humanities. Remember, this is only a very small sample of the thousands of grants we have made over more than 50 years. And the projects highlighted here don't mean that we only make grants for these kinds of topics or these kinds of organizations. We are interested in supporting whatever ideas, projects, organizations come to us. The Massachusetts Historical Society has used NEH support to offer workshops for K-12 teachers about the American Revolution, focusing on the battles of Lexington and Concord. The teachers learn about the battles on site and develop new teaching materials and approaches. Faculty at Whatcom Community College in Bellingham, Washington, used an NEH grant to support develop a new curriculum centered on the Salish Sea, a marine ecosystem on the Pacific coast. The curriculum will use digital mapping technology, as well as traditional storytelling practices, to understand the cultural history of the region. The project is a partnership with local schools and the Native American community. A team of scholars based at Mississippi State University produced a 32-volume edition of the papers of Ulysses S. Grant, military leader and president. This huge project is also now available online. It's been a tremendous resource for scholars and teachers. It received several large NEH grants. With the support of a small NEH grant, a professor at the University of Kansas wrote an important book on the impact of Charles Darwin's thought on American culture. Ken Burns and his colleagues have produced almost 30 television documentaries, engaging the public about a wide variety of topics, from baseball and national parks to jazz and war, including an important series about the Vietnam War. Every one of his films has been supported by grants from the NEH. With an NEH grant, the Lancaster County Historical Society in Pennsylvania has restored the home of Thaddeus Stevens, who served in Congress during and after the Civil War, highlighting Stevens's role in emancipation and civil rights. A team of linguists and literature scholars based at the University of Wisconsin spent 30 years creating a richly documented dictionary of English, as it's used in different kinds of ways all over the country. The resulting 6-volume publication, still growing online, is a great resource for scholars, authors, and journalists, and a fascination for the general public. The Hermosa Arts and History Association in South Dakota used a small NEH grant to record and preserve stories about immigrants in its community. The NEH has recently been supporting some very exciting projects using new digital technology for humanities research. For instance, a team of literary scholars, archaeologists, and computer scientists have used CT scans and sophisticated imaging software to recover ancient scrolls that were buried in the eruption of Vesuvius. Meanwhile, a small Louisiana nonprofit called Shift Design used a grant to develop a platform called History Pin, where the public can connect their old photographs to historic events and the modern landscape. Old Christ Church, an historic Episcopal congregation in Philadelphia, used an NEH matching grant to bolster fundraising so that it could renovate its landmark steeple. Pellissippi State Community College in Tennessee used NEH matching funds to renovate its library and build a new Appalachian Heritage Project focused on regional literature and poetry, history, and folklore. You should also know that every state and territory has a Humanities Council, supported in part by the NEH. These councils do public programming across their state, and many also make grants. If you're seeking financial support for a public humanities project, you should contact your state council. They're terrific organizations, and they have a real impact on their communities. In addition to all of our regular grant programs, the NEH is also preparing for the 250th anniversary of United States independence in 2026 by funding projects for a more perfect union. This initiative promotes civic education and a deeper understanding of American history and culture. Applications to NEH programs do not need to respond to this initiative, but we are supporting a good deal of programming on these themes. I've told you about the kinds of things that NEH grants can support, but there's also a list of things that our grants cannot support. We don't support humanitarian work, like feeding the hungry or opening daycare centers. We don't support the creative arts. That's our friends at the National Endowment for the Arts. That includes autobiography, fiction, and poetry. We don't make grants to students. We don't support political advocacy or policy studies. And we don't support science research or the quantitative social sciences. You may also be wondering who's eligible to apply for an NEH grant. Most of our grant applicants are US-based nonprofit organizations, like libraries, museums, or universities. They must have 501c3 status. A few programs are designed for individuals, supporting scholars doing research and writing. That can include independent scholars, as well as college or university faculty. Applicants must be citizens or resident in the US for at least 3 years before the deadline. Again, students are not eligible. The best source for information about the endowment's work is our website at neh.gov. It has all of our grant programs and a lot of other information. On the site, you'll find information about how to apply for a grant. At the bottom of the page, you'll find an online database with all of our previous grants made over our 55 years of history. When you click on the Grants tab, you'll find a list of all 38 grant programs offered by the NEH, with links to information for each of those programs. With 38 grant programs, you might feel a bit overwhelmed when trying to find the right program for your project. Here's a hint. The NEH is organized by the audiences for grant products. Each of our divisions targets different groups. So you should think about the audience for your work and then look at the grants for the appropriate division. So if your project is serving the general public, like museum visitors or people watching documentaries, you should look to the Division of Public Programs. If your project is aimed at researchers and library users, your grants are probably in the Division of Preservation and Access. If your project is classroom focused, look at the Division of Education Programs. If you're doing research and writing for scholars or general readers, those grants are the Division of Research Programs. If you're creating new digital technologies, look at the Office of Digital Humanities. And if your organization is doing major fundraising, turn to the Office of Challenge Programs. The site includes a page for each grant program. Each page will tell you the application deadline, the funding statistics in recent years, and who to contact if you have questions. The most important information on each page is in the guidelines, which are called the Notice of Funding Opportunity. These documents are long and a bit bureaucratic, but grant applicants should spend some time reading them. They'll tell you who can and who cannot apply for a grant, what grants can and cannot support, what an application should include, and how applications will be evaluated. Also on this page is a list of recently funded applications, which will give you a sense of the kinds of things that a program can support, and a list of sample applications that you can use as inspiration for your application. Applications for NEH grants, like many federal grants, are submitted through a web portal called grants.gov. It is a fairly smooth system, but it would be good for you to spend some time getting familiar with it before you submit your application. You'll need to register about a week or so before applying. We strongly urge that you apply early, as it gets pretty overwhelmed in the last 5 minutes before a midnight deadline. Here's the bad news of this presentation. These grants are very competitive. Acceptance rates vary by program, from 8% to 20% of the applications we receive. That's not because we're mean, but simply because we receive a lot of applications. But don't let those numbers scare you away. You can't get a grant unless you apply. During the rest of this session, I'll share some suggestions about how to write a good grant application. These suggestions might be useful as you think about applying to the NEH or to any funder. I'll discuss each one in more detail, but here are the key points. Plan ahead. Understand the peer review process. Read the review criteria. Understand your audience. Make your case for your project. And pay attention to details. First, you should plan ahead. The grant application process is lengthy, and so is the review process, and you may not get a grant the first time you apply, so you should apply early and often. If you anticipate needing a grant in the next 2 years, you should start planning now for your application. Here are a few things you can do to prepare for a successful grant application. First, make sure you're applying to the right grant program. Programs have rules about what they can support and what they can't support. Your project may be a better fit for one program or another. Read the guidelines. If you're not sure, contact a program officer. We can help you figure out what program to look at. Look at the guidelines, called the Notice of Funding Opportunity. As I said, they're long and complex, but they can be really useful. They'll tell you what is eligible and what is not, and what an application shouldn't contain. Most importantly, they will tell you the criteria that evaluators will look for when reviewing applications. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. The website also contains samples of previously successful applications. Don't imitate them, but use them as an example of how somebody else made a case for their project. They can help you think about structure and form. Talk to program officers. That's what we're here for. Unlike some foundations, we answer the phone and we reply to email. Ask questions, discuss ideas, and think about strategy. Program officers read drafts for many programs. Take advantage of that. It will help you get feedback that will help you write a stronger application. Every NEH grant application goes through the process of peer review. That means that each application is read by a committee of outside experts recruited by NEH staff. Teachers read education applications. Librarians read library applications. Museum professionals read museum applications. You get the idea. They evaluate the applications based on carefully defined criteria. They assign a rating and write comments. In many cases, they meet to discuss the applications and enrich their evaluations. NEH staff takes the committee recommendations to the National Council of Humanities, pictured here, a board of 26 humanities professionals appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. The chairman of the NEH takes all these recommendations into account when making grant applications. All this means that your application is being evaluated by people like you, people who know the humanities and who understand the work you do. You should know that our reviewers take this process seriously. They are very generous. Knowing how this process works will help you write a better application. Your audience includes both specialists and generalists. Your application must inform them effectively about your project. Show the generalists why it is important, and the specialists that you know what you're doing. Our panelists often read a lot of applications. Please make it easy on them. Make it clear what you're doing. Don't hide your topic. And limit jargon, which can often put off our panelists. Explicitly address the criteria. They're key. We ask our panelists to consider them and only them when reading an application. I'll say more about that in a moment. Use some concrete examples to describe your project. When making broad claims for your project's importance, provide an example or two to show how your project will work. This will make your application not only more understandable, but also more credible and more interesting to your readers. Show your evaluators that you know what you're doing. Show them that you know your topic and that you know what needs to be done to bring the project to a successful conclusion. This is hard, but anticipate the concerns that a panelist might raise and answer them. Panelists may ask, why is this project important? Can this applicant really do the planned work in the scheduled time? Answer those kinds of questions before they ask them. If you've been working on a project for a while, you know the potential pitfalls. Anticipate panelists by raising those concerns and addressing them yourself. As I mentioned, the peer reviewers use carefully defined criteria when evaluating applications. Those criteria are included in the notice of funding opportunity for the program to which you're applying. Print them out and keep them in mind as you're writing your application. The criteria are different for every program, but they address similar issues. I'll show you a few examples. For instance, here are the criteria for the Preservation Assistant Grants Program, which makes small grants to libraries and museums. These criteria focus on the significance of the materials, the appropriateness of the work planned, and the qualifications of the staff. And here are the criteria for the Public Humanities Projects Program, which makes large grants to museums and historical societies. Because these projects are more complex and the grants are bigger, the criteria are more complex too. But the basic questions are the same: the significance of the topic, the appropriateness of the work planned, and the qualifications of the staff. Your application should use the criteria to make the case for your project. It should persuade your readers that your project is important and that you know what you're doing. You might even explicitly address the criteria in your narrative. For almost all NEH programs, the most important criterion is significance. Tell the evaluators why the project is important and how it will impact its audiences. As a part of making a case for your project's significance, put it in a larger context. Explain how your project fits in with similar kinds of work. Emphasize what is unique about your project. Our panelists often read a lot of applications. They like applications that intrigue them. Make them want to know the answers to the questions you're asking. Be clear about what you're going to do during the grant period. It's what we call a work plan. Be as specific as possible. Most applications require a budget. Don't let that scare you off. But take care when putting a budget together. The NEH has rules for what is and what isn't allowed. Look at the instructions and sample budgets on the website. Talk to a program officer. More importantly, Your organization probably has even more rules about salaries and other cost issues. Talk to your grant administrator or finance office well before you start working on the application and well before the deadline. Remember that the NEH is a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies pay attention to details. Your application will be stronger if you pay attention to details too. Draft your application early. Don't wait until the last minute. That may be apparent in the quality of your application. Get comments from your colleagues or mentors, especially those who don't know the details of your subject. The more non-specialist eyes you can get in your draft, the better. Program officers at the NEH will read drafts for most programs. Please get it to us at least 6 weeks before the deadline. Make sure that you include all the required materials. Incomplete applications are not reviewed. Proofread. You don't want your wonderful ideas to be overwhelmed by spelling errors. And make sure you're sending us an application designed for the NEH. Don't send us an application that is written for some other funder. Here are some common errors we see in applications. It is clear in many cases that the applicants have not read the guidelines. Again, the Notice of Funding Opportunity is long and bureaucratic, but it is helpful to you. It tells you what should be included and what can be funded. Too often we get generic applications as opposed to the ones written especially for the NEH. Those guidelines will tell you the criteria for evaluation, and the most important is the project's significance. The language varies a bit from program to program, but across the board at the NEH, the most important evaluation criterion is the project's importance for its targeted audience or audiences. The biggest weakness in many applications is not making a case for significance. Applicants need to demonstrate why their work will be important, whether it be for teachers, for the general public, or for scholars. Many applications forget to include a work plan or have a vague one. Make it clear what you're going to do during the grant period and how it will contribute to the project's goals. Your plans may change, but a developed work plan gives your evaluators confidence that you know what you're doing and how you will do it. We get applications that use a lot of jargon, and that often turns off our panelists. We like to see that our applicants are up on the latest developments in their area, but we also want to see that they can communicate their work clearly. Bear in mind that the evaluators for your application may not know the specialized language of your topic. If you're using an esoteric term, you may want to define it or use a different term. Finally, applicants often get into trouble when they don't plan ahead. You want to make sure that you have enough time to study the guidelines, plan your project, consult with your administration, draft your application, and get feedback from colleagues. If you plan on doing a project in the next 2 years, start planning your application now. As I mentioned a while ago, this is a competitive process. For many of our programs, we can only fund 10% of the applications we receive. Again, that's not because we're mean, but we just get a lot of applications, and we can't fund as many as we'd like. So don't be discouraged if you get turned down. Don't take it personally. Instead, make plans to reapply. The most important thing you can do is to request the comments from your peer review committee. Our evaluators are very smart and very generous. They take the review process seriously and do their best to write constructive comments for each application. Whether you get a grant or your application is rejected, you should request the comments because you'll find them very helpful as you continue your work. If you have questions about the panelists' comments, contact the program officer. They can help you interpret the comments and strategize for a new application. If you do get turned down, reapply. Our experience is that resubmissions are more likely to be successful the second time around because applicants have clarified and strengthen their application. One more thing before we take questions. You should know that NEH staff are public servants and want to be your allies. We are humanities professionals, scholars, teachers, librarians, museum professionals. We support public and scholarly engagement with the humanities because we believe in the humanities and their importance for American culture. If you take away nothing else today, know that, unlike some foundations, NEH staff are happy to talk with you by phone or email. Program officers can help you navigate through the grant process, from application to final report. We can help you determine the right grant program for your project. We can offer advice on preparing applications. For many programs, we will read and offer feedback on draft proposals. I hope this has been helpful. We're now ready to take your questions. Please type your questions into the Q&A box on your screen. My colleagues have already been answering some specific questions, and Ellen has been identifying questions that might be interesting to a general audience. So I'll try to answer as many of those as I can. If your question isn't answered today, you can also email it to us at congressional@neh.gov. Ellen?
All right. Our first question is, does asking for help or asking NEH to review my application hurt my chances of getting a grant?
Absolutely not. As I mentioned, we read drafts for many programs, and program officers will read them and send back feedback, but that does not enter into the review process at all. So nothing that is said in that draft process will all enter into final grant decisions. So that does not affect any decisions that are made.
How long does the application review process take?
That's a good question. It's pretty lengthy. It's about 8 months from the application deadline to the notification date. And that's simply because we get a lot of applications and our peer review process is pretty rich and pretty complex. And so that means that it takes a while to make it happen.
Can an institution apply for multiple grants?
Yes, institutions can apply for multiple grants, and they can hold multiple grants. Individuals can only hold one grant at a time, but institutions can hold multiple grants at a time as long as they're doing different kinds of work.
Can state and local governments apply for NEH grants?
I'm fairly certain the answer to that question is yes. State governments, local governments, and tribal governments can apply for grants.
Can you talk a little bit more about the More Perfect Union initiative? Does it
Sure.
have its own grant or guidelines?
It does not have its own grants or guidelines. Those projects are funded as part of other grant programs. There's also some special initiatives that our chairman's office is doing, sort of making some direct grants to a couple of specific organizations, but there's no separate grant line for those. This is part of a special budget that is set aside from our congressional appropriation, which we're using for this programming. And so if you have a project that might fit under that, you should look at the guidelines for the program that would best fit the work that you're doing, and then apply through that and highlight your interest in the 250th, the More Perfect Union work.
All right. Would a music school be eligible to apply under education programs? Where's the line between arts and humanities?
I would draw the line at the study of versus the creation performance of. So if a music school or faculty in a music school is doing, say, a music history project or a cultural history project that involves music or some of the sort, that's absolutely eligible for the NEH. If they're looking to perform music or compose music, that should go to the NEA as opposed to the NEH.
What grant program might capital historic building projects fit under, i.e. the historic church tower restoration?
So that would go to our Office of Challenge Programs. So if they're looking to do fundraising for a major project like that, that would go to our Office of Challenge Programs, which has a infrastructure program, which does matching grants. The match ranges from, I think, 3 to 1 to 4 to 1, and up to, I think, $700,000. There's more information on all of that on our website. I think there's 2 deadlines a year, but that should be for the Office of Challenge Programs.
All right. Can you talk a little bit about whether NEH funds smaller grants? What are the smallest grants awarded by NEH?
So the smallest grant that I'm aware of is the Preservation Assistance Grant, which is our Division of Preservation and Access. So this is for small libraries, museums, and historical societies that are looking for a grant to help preserve documents or make them available to the public. And I believe those are $6,000. The Research Division also has grants for individuals. The summer stipend is also $6,000 to support 2 months worth of research and writing for an individual scholar. So those are the smallest grants that I'm aware of at the NEH.
My organization spans both arts and education. We currently receive funding from NEA, but that doesn't support our education branch. Can we also apply to NEH?
Absolutely. Again, as I said earlier, as long as it's educational work that involving the study, the history of music, as opposed to the performance and creation of music, those kinds of parts of your work can indeed come to the NEH, to the Division of Education Programs.
Sorry, we're getting so many questions, just going through them.
That's fine.
Due to the high non-funding rate, will a requester apply multiple years for the exact same project?
I think the question is, can you apply multiple years for the same project if you get turned down the first time? And
Yes.
The answer is yes. Each application is new, so every application we receive, we take it to a new peer review committee. They don't know there's been a previous grant, a previous application. They won't know you've been turned down before. So each application is new, and so that a reapplication is fine. It is smart, if you're going to reapply, to take a look at the comments from the previous grant cycle to see what the reviewer said the previous time, to see if there's ways you can strengthen your application. But absolutely, reapplications are certainly acceptable. And as I said in the presentation, our experience is often a reapplication is more likely to be successful, in part because the project may have moved along further, it may have developed a little more, but also because they've taken into account the comments that have come from the reviewers that set the previous go-round.
Does the creation of a new or a revised exhibit space qualify under one of these programs?
That would need to go to our public Division of Public Programs. I think the answer to that question is yes. That would probably be in public programs in the humanities program there. So drop them a line. I think the answer to that question is yes. Creation of exhibits and renovation exhibits would fit in there.
We've gotten a couple of questions about our peer review panels,
yeah.
Whether they're new every year. I think people would be interested in learning more about how they are assembled,
sure.
And who exactly are the people looking over their grants.
Sure. So as I mentioned during the presentation, peer review committee members are experts in the field, and it varies on the program. I'm in the research division. We're making grants for scholarly projects. So our reviewers are scholars in the field. In public programs, there are people who run museums or make film documentaries. In education, there are people who are teaching in K-12 or college. So it really varies division by division. The panelists are recruited by NEH staff. Many of our panelists are previous grantees, so they know NEH grant programs. Others are people who about who seem to have expertise in the topic and in the field. NEH program officers work very hard to create broad and diverse peer review committees. We look across the country. We have to have representation from different parts of the country, from different kinds of institutions, from junior scholars, senior scholars, men, women, all those kinds of diversity are aimed to be represented on our peer review committees. And we cannot use the same peer reviewers year after year. Every peer review committee is new.
Many programs require applicants to have a scholar involved with the project. Can you talk more about what would make a good scholar?
Sure. So a scholar representative on a team should be a person who understands the field. So understands the field of whether it be a documentary or museum exhibit or whatever, but then also has a role in the project. So a person who can participate in projects meetings, can help shape the script for the documentary or the format for the exhibit or the organization of the library collection and can testify in the application to the significance of the topic and the materials. It needn't necessarily be a name. We're really looking for a person who can bring expertise as opposed to celebrity into the process.
Does success on a smaller grant for a project increase chances to be awarded a larger grant later on to expand that same project later?
That's a good question. I think the answer to that question is probably yes, because having held a previous grant and then successfully completing that previous grant shows that you'd be a good applicant, that you'd be a good responsible recipient of a new grant. So that in itself, I think, would help to strengthen a grant application. There are some rules about coming back for a second grant. So for instance, on our fellowships program, if you've had one fellowship for a particular project, you cannot hold a second fellowship for the same project. You can for a different project, but not for the same project. On the other hand, if you have a summer stipend grant, you can then come back for a fellowship next year for the same project. So the rules vary a little bit, and that's spelled out in the notice of funding opportunity. That's a long answer. This is absolutely holding a second grant, holding a first grant, I think makes you a stronger applicant for the second grant.
We've had several questions about getting copies of this webinar or copies of the slide deck. And I just want to say, if you would like any of this information, please contact us at congressional@neh.gov, the address on your screen, and we will reach out to you afterwards to provide you the information. We are getting a wide variety of questions. Some of them are very specific to projects that you might have in mind. If you would like advice, you can also reach out to that same email address, and we will direct you to the appropriate division that will be best able to help you out. All right. I'm not seeing any more questions at this time. Most of these are already being, handled in the chat by some of our colleagues. So thank you so much for coming out today, and please let us know if there's absolutely anything we can help you with. Thank you so much for your time joining us.